Yesterday morning, my sister-in-law threw a damp hand towel across the kitchen island, looked me dead in the eye, and told me to hand over my 6-month-old daughter so I could scrub her floors and prep a 3-course dinner before guests arrived. While my baby wailed in her bouncer from hunger, my husband sat on the living room sofa, scrolling his phone and telling me to just keep the peace. They thought I was trapped, dependent, and broken. They had no idea that I wasn't just staying in this house to serve them. I was staying to make sure every single asset, deed, and bank account tied to my husband's family empire legally belonged to me before I walked out the door forever. My name is Clara, I am 32 years old, and yesterday morning my sister-in-law threw a damp hand towel across the kitchen island, looked me dead in the eye, and told me to hand over my 6-month-old daughter so I could scrub her floors and prep a 3-course dinner before guests arrived. While my baby wailed in her bouncer from hunger, my husband sat on the living room sofa, scrolling his phone and telling me to just keep the peace. They thought I was trapped, dependent, and broken. They had no idea that I wasn't just staying in this house to serve them. I was staying to make sure every single asset, deed, and bank account tied to my husband's family empire legally belonged to me before I walked out the door forever. Living in the ancestral stone mansion on the North Shore had always felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. When I married Mark 5 years ago, I thought I was partnering with a grounded, ambitious man. Instead, I inherited his entire dysfunctional family orbit, anchored by his domineering sister Victoria. Victoria didn't work a day in her life, living off the fading prestige of our last name while treating me like an unpaid live-in servant. Every single day was a new demand, a new complaint, and a calculated reminder that I came from a modest working-class background and therefore owed them my endless labor. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday that started out like any other nightmare. Little Maya was cutting her first tooth, running a slight fever and screaming in her bouncer because she was starving. I had just managed to sterilize her bottle when Victoria marched into the kitchen in her silk robe, dumped a basket of her expensive gym clothes onto the clean counter, and demanded I wash them by hand immediately because the machine might snag the fabric. When I politely explained that I needed to feed and soothe my crying baby first, Victoria scoffed, rolled her eyes and casually uttered the words that severed the last thread of my patience. She told me that my child could wait, but her schedule couldn't, and that I needed to learn my place in this household. Before I could even respond, Mark walked into the kitchen, smelling of expensive cologne and holding his car keys. He didn't look at his crying daughter. He didn't look at me, exhausted and pale with dark circles under my eyes. He simply looked at Victoria with a sympathetic sigh and then turned his cold gaze onto me. He told me to just stop being so dramatic, do what my sister asked, and keep the peace for once in my life. He said those exact words, just keep the peace. In that single heartbeat, every ounce of lingering affection, every memory of why I loved him, and every hope for our marriage dissolved into absolute ash. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a plate or start a shouting match. I looked at my husband, looked at his entitled sister, and felt a cold, terrifying calm wash over me. They thought my silence meant submission. They were catastrophically wrong. It was the exact second I decided to stop fighting back with words and instead let my secret exit strategy crush them entirely. Flashbacks to 5 years ago felt like watching a movie about a completely different person. When I first met Mark at a charity gala downtown, he was charming, attentive, and seemingly independent. I was a junior corporate accountant back then, proud of my hard-earned credentials and living in a modest downtown apartment I paid for entirely on my own. Mark pursued me relentlessly, painting a picture of a shared future built on mutual respect and equal partnership. But the moment we signed our marriage license and moved into his family's ancestral estate, the mask slipped entirely. I quickly realized I hadn't married a partner. I had been absorbed into a dynastic ecosystem of narcissistic parasites. The financial dynamic in that household was designed to keep me perpetually off balance. While Mark and Victoria bled the family's manufacturing business dry through high-risk investments, luxury cars, and lavish international vacations, they expected me to fund our household groceries, utility bills, and my own personal expenses out of my modest salary. Whenever I pointed out the glaring discrepancies in our joint ledger, Mark would dismiss my concerns with a condescending wave of his hand, reminding me that financial management was men's work, and that I should just stick to balancing my little spreadsheet. They treated me like a financial liability while quietly exploiting every ounce of my stability to keep their failing lifestyle afloat. What they didn't know, what none of them ever bothered to find out, was that my professional background went far deeper than basic household budgeting. As a senior forensic auditor specializing in corporate embezzlement and asset tracing, I spent my days uncovering hidden transactions for Fortune 500 companies. 6 months into our marriage, when I noticed suspicious wire transfers moving out of joint accounts into private offshore shells controlled by Victoria, my professional instincts kicked in. I didn't get angry, I got curious. I started quietly auditing the family holding company's ledger, and what I uncovered was an absolute goldmine of systemic fraud, tax evasion and illegal asset stripping orchestrated entirely by Victoria and rubber-stamped by Mark to cover his own negligence. Over the next 3 years, while they assumed I was folding laundry and managing the nursery, I was systematically building an impenetrable fortress of digital evidence. Every unauthorized corporate withdrawal, every falsified tax document, every hidden property deed purchased with embezzled capital was quietly copied, encrypted, and backed up to a secure cloud vault only I could access. I even uncovered a series of pre-signed corporate resolutions where Mark had unknowingly signed away his voting shares to Victoria, making her legally vulnerable to the exact crime she thought she was hiding. I had all the receipts, notarized and cross-referenced down to the penny. They thought they had trapped a quiet, obedient housewife in their gilded cage. In reality, they had invited an apex predator into their corporate vault, and I was just waiting for the right moment to lock the door. The tension inside the ancestral mansion reached a suffocating peak when Victoria announced her grand anniversary dinner party. She had invited over 50 high society guests, including local politicians, board members, and wealthy business associates, purely to flex her social dominance and parade Mark around as her golden boy brother. 2 days before the event, Victoria cornered me in the hallway, handing down a list of demands that felt less like party planning and more like a cruel endurance test. She expected me to personally cook a gourmet 5-course menu from scratch, clean the entire 6,000 square foot estate, arrange all the floral decorations, and simultaneously tend to a teething, crying baby without hiring any outside help. The morning of the dinner party was absolute chaos, but I moved through the kitchen with a chilling, artificial serenity. When Victoria swept into the dining room dressed in a blinding silk designer gown, she took one look at my simple, plain blouse and sneered. In front of the first arriving guests, she loudly joked that she was glad I finally dressed down so people wouldn't confuse the kitchen staff with the family. Several guests chuckled at her expense, enjoying the easy cruelty. I didn't flinch. I just smiled politely, handed her a tray of canapés, and walked back toward the kitchen to finish plating the appetizers. 10 minutes before the main course was scheduled to be served, Mark intercepted me in the hallway. His expression was tight with nervous irritation, his eyes darting toward the crowded dining room where influential investors were mingling. He grabbed my arm just a little too hard, his fingers pressing into my skin through my sleeve, and whispered a vicious warning through clenched teeth. He told me that if I embarrassed him tonight with my sullen attitude, or if anything went wrong with the food or service, he would make sure I regretted it for the rest of my life. He demanded that I keep my head down, smile for his business associates, and play the role of the devoted, supportive wife. I looked right into his eyes, let out a soft, compliant sigh, and gave him the exact performance he wanted. I told him he had nothing to worry about, that everything was completely under control, and that tonight was going to be an unforgettable evening for everyone in that room. Mark blinked, momentarily disarmed by my sudden submission, before flashing a smug, self-satisfied grin. He patted my cheek patronizingly and told me that was a good girl, turning around to rejoin his elite guests without a single clue that he had just handed me the keys to his entire downfall. Inside the dining room, the heavy mahogany chandelier cast a warm, golden glow over the long table. 50 guests were seated, laughing, clinking crystal champagne flutes, and waiting for the grand feast to begin. Victoria stood at the head of the table, tapping her glass with a silver spoon to demand everyone's attention for a toast. She beamed with absolute triumph, looking every bit like an untouchable queen presiding over her kingdom. She signaled toward the kitchen doors, smugly expecting me to walk out carrying the first course on a silver platter, completely unaware that I was about to serve them something far heavier, permanent, and utterly devastating. The grand mahogany doors of the dining room swung open, but I didn't step out carrying a silver tray or steaming dishes. Instead, I walked in holding a thick, heavy leather binder in one hand and a sleek portable projector in the other, my footsteps echoing sharply against the marble floor. The lively chatter around the long table faded into a tense, confused silence as 50 high society guests turned to stare. Victoria's triumphant smile faltered, her champagne glass hovering halfway to her mouth. Mark shoved his chair back, his face flushing crimson with sudden embarrassment and rising panic. He took a sharp step forward, his voice cracking slightly as he ordered me to get back into the kitchen immediately and stop making a scene in front of his investors. I ignored him entirely, plugging the projector into the media port near the head table and tapping my phone screen. Instantly, a massive crystal-clear projection lit up the antique wallpaper behind Victoria, displaying the audited bank records, encrypted server logs and forensic wire transfers of the family's manufacturing business. The room gasped as bold red underlines highlighted unauthorized offshore accounts, fabricated tax receipts, and millions of dollars systematically embezzled over the last 4 years. Victoria's color drained completely, her hands trembling so violently she had to set her glass down to avoid shattering it. Before anyone could process the financial data, I clicked to the next slide. Certified corporate filings and forged asset titles proving that Victoria had been systematically stripping the company assets behind the board's back, with Mark actively signing off to cover her tracks. Mark lunged forward, trying to block the projector beam with his body, shouting that it was all forged garbage, a malicious lie concocted by a bitter, unstable wife. But his desperate protests died in his throat as I calmly reached into my leather binder and pulled out a stack of pristine legal documents. I walked right up to his place setting and dropped the papers directly onto his expensive porcelain dinner plate, right beside his half-eaten appetizer. They weren't just standard divorce papers. They were finalized corporate seizure notices and court-approved asset freezing orders issued by the state high court earlier that very morning. I looked down at Mark, then over at a terrified Victoria, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the dead-silent room. I informed them that under a silent debt buyout and emergency receivership motion filed by the primary creditors, whose debts I had quietly acquired control of over the past 6 months using my own independent assets and inheritance, this estate, the company, and every single asset they owned legally belonged to me. The residential deed, the bank accounts, the luxury cars parked outside. Everything was now under my sole legal authority. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the projector fan. Mark stared down at the papers on his plate like they were venomous snakes, completely paralyzed, while Victoria collapsed back into her chair, realizing in absolute crushing horror that their entire empire had just been legally dismantled in a single heartbeat. The immediate aftermath in that dining room felt like watching a slow-motion catastrophe. Within minutes of the documents landing on the table, 2 county sheriff's deputies arrived at the front entrance, responding to the emergency asset freezing order and the corporate fraud warrants. Victoria's high society friends scattered like frightened pigeons, whispering behind gloved hands and rushing toward their luxury cars to distance themselves from the unfolding scandal. Mark stood frozen at the head of the table, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he realized his career, his social standing, and his entire inheritance had evaporated in a single night. Victoria dissolved into hysterical tears, screaming accusations at me that cut through the quiet hum of the room, but the deputies simply escorted them both toward the exit, informing them that the estate was now under my lawful receivership. I didn't watch them pack. I simply walked upstairs to the master nursery, packed a single duffel bag with Maya's clothes and my personal belongings, and strapped my happy cooing baby into her car seat. As I carried her down the grand staircase and out the heavy oak front doors, I took one last look at the towering stone mansion. It no longer felt like a gilded cage or a place of fear. It was just an empty, hollow shell owned by a woman who had thought money and cruelty were enough to conquer the world. I slid into the driver's seat of my own car, purchased with my own hard-earned money years ago, and drove away into the cool evening air, leaving behind 2 parasites who finally had to face the real world without a safety net. Today, sitting on the sunlit private balcony of my own independent beachfront condo, the contrast couldn't be more complete. The salty breeze carries the gentle sound of crashing waves against the shore, and in my arms, Maya sleeps soundlessly, breathing in the peace of a home built on honesty and true strength. I didn't need to raise my voice, throw a punch, or lower myself to their petty level to win back my life. I simply let their greed blind them, used my own mind to build an unshakable foundation, and let the law do the heavy lifting. If you have ever been treated like a servant in your own home, or made to feel small by people who take your kindness for weakness, remember this. Don't waste your energy screaming at them. Just stay quiet, do the work, gather your receipts, and build a life so strong that when you finally walk away, their entire world crumbles behind you.